I was a kid when I learned about the world that existed at the micro level. I learned that there are microorganisms like bacteria and fungi and viruses and all that. These are just too small to be visible to the naked eye. But you see, I learned about them in school. And we already know how lazy and boring and lethargic such classes were. There is no spark in the eyes of teacher when they introduce these things to a batch of students. The whole affair is, at least to me, too intolerable to suffer, and an absolute disgrace. Our universe is rich and full of jaw-dropping beauty. And a class in which such splendor is introduced to the young minds in boring ways is, well, a disgrace. And this applies to everything in science. The retired physicist at MIT, Professor Walter Lewin, very well said, "Teachers who make physics boring are criminals." And I agree with him. In fact, I want to say out loud that teachers who make anything in science boring are criminals. How amazing it is that there is a rich diversity of living things right on your fingertip. These things crawl and swim and communicate and can make more and more copies of themselves. How amazing is that? I mean, a speck of sand can't do that. It can't crawl and swim and communicate and make copies of itself. But these little creatures do precisely that, and they do it without any external help. This is just wow. On top of it, they are everywhere, in the forests, inside rivers, on mountaintops, on your smartphone screens, and even inside your gut, Innumerable young people are forced to cram the names and details of this microworld, because that's how they can excel in their tests and exams. An experience that could have been full of magic and surprises is consistently made dull and torturous. How disgraceful. I always wanted to know the history of scientific discoveries, of the wonderful anecdotes of those eureka moments, of how people must have responded when they first discovered this enormous and all-pervading and all-controlling microworld. It must have been a mix of surprise and laughter. And I must admit, I was surprised to know that the man who first observed these swimming things was in fact not a scientist. He was a cloth merchant. He got himself a really good magnifying glass because he wanted to know the consistency of the fabric he purchased and sold. His name? Antony van Leeuwenhoek. The time was 1670s and the place, the Netherlands. And just to give you a little context, at this very time, back in the north, in Britain, Isaac Newton was studying gravity. Around the same time in Netherlands, the cloth market was booming. Silks and velvet and wool and linen and cotton came in swaths and bundles from ports and European colonies and were traded throughout continental Europe. Leeuwenhoek built himself a simple microscope to look for faults in fabric. But the microscope was a wonderful device because it was, well, addictive. You could look for anything and everything minute, anything too small to be seen by naked eyes. Naturally, Leeuwenhoek got addicted, and his interest turned compulsive. He focused his lens on whatever object he could find. His microscope made him restless. One day, he tried the same thing on rainwater. He collected some rainwater from the drains of his rooftop, let it stand for a day, and then put a droplet under one of his simple microscopes. And there was a big boom in his head. No one he knew had seen anything like it before. The water was full of little animals. He called them animalcules, small and cute animals. People had seen Jupiter and Saturn in the bigger cosmos, but no one he knew had seen these tiny animals in this smaller cosmos. He was baffled. He later wrote, "This was to me, among all the marvels I have discovered in the nature, the most marvelous among them all. No greater pleasure has yet come to my eye than these spectacles of thousands of living creatures in a droplet of water." With time, his amazement made him build finer microscopes all by himself. He would purchase the highest quality of beads and globules of Venetian glass, ground them and polished them laboriously into perfect lenses. Over time, he made nearly 500 such microscopes in an increasing order of precision. He wanted to make sure whether or not such animals are found elsewhere as well. Therefore, one day he entreated a man who was traveling to the seaside to bring him a sample of water from the sea. Again, he found many mouse-like animals swimming in the seawater. Finally, in 1676, he resolved to report this discovery to a scientific society of his time. This was what he wrote, and observe the excitement in his description. I have discovered living creatures in, guess what, rainwater, which had stood for a few days in a new earthen pot. When these animalcula or living atoms move, they put forth two horns, continually moving. The rest of the body was roundish, sharpening a little towards the end, where they had a tail nearly 4 times the length of the body. Later, in 1677, he subjected his own semen to his observation. Again, there was an explosion of wonder. He again saw little living things moving like a snake or an eel swimming in water. He had discovered sperm cells, but he had no idea of what they were. You see, this was the 1670s and no one had a clue about the mechanics of reproduction. The problem with Lewin was that he had never been to a university. He was trained neither as a philosopher, a medical man, or a gentleman. He was very reluctant to let observers and scientists examine his instruments. The Royal Society requested Lewin time and again to acquaint them with his method of observing so that others may confirm such observations. He didn't allow it. The only way to believe this Draper-turned-microscopist was to trust the testimony of 8 Delft residents that he'd assembled. They saw that the swimming animals could indeed be observed through his instruments. Siddharth Mukherjee jokingly calls it a science by affidavit. Some 10 years before Lewin, the scientist Robert Hooke had also discovered little boxes on a wooden cork, a honeycomb-like structure. It was Hooke who, after going through a glossary of words, finally named them cells, Latin for small rooms. But it took Hooke a long time to report to the Royal Society about his findings of the small animals swimming to and fro, like those of the Lewin. There is evidence that Hooke and Lewin had correspondence in 1680. It was likely Hooke who saved the reputation of Lewin for posterity. Hooke's own interest in microbiology and microscopy eventually dwindled. His contributions, therefore, were forgotten. This was the story of a cloth merchant, about whom almost every high school kid knows. And it was his curiosity and childlike appetite for wonder that made him unforgettable. The thrill of that first encounter with this invisible microworld never left him, and will never leave me. The world had discovered cells, thanks to the living thrill that Lewin was. Also, if cells exist, they must be doing something. What followed him was an intense cascade of activity in the domain of cell biology and biogenesis. This story will eventually pass through the infant cellular pathology, and we will meet Rudolf Virchow once again. All this is the subject of the next video.